It's been going on for an hour.
November 14th, 2025. It was just past midnight local time. Everything appeared normal in the Novorossiysk Gulf. For the Russian soldiers on guard duty along the shore, it was an ordinary night. But within seconds, they would encounter Neptune missiles armed with hundreds of kilograms of explosives. These were no ordinary missiles. They were land-based, with a range of 1,000 kilometers and reinforced with heavy explosive payloads. But for Ukraine, this was still an almost impossible task, because the port of Novorossiysk was the most heavily guarded area after Moscow. This was not an ordinary seaport. It was Russia's largest port. It was bigger than St. Petersburg or Murmansk. A multi-layered air defense system supported by Pantsir and Tor systems, a total of 12 S-400 launchers stood over Novorossiysk like an invisible dome. Breaking through this dome seemed impossible even for Neptune missiles. For Russian generals, Novorossiysk was a untouchable box on the map, outlined in thick red. But that night, the generals' complacency would cost Putin's army dearly. Because Neptune missiles were perhaps the only weak point in the seemingly impenetrable S-400 defense. Somewhere in Ukraine, a camouflage truck was quietly waiting, hidden among the pine trees. This truck was stationed in the Odessa region, at least 600 kilometers away from the port. The non-commissioned officer sitting in the driver's seat reached for the red cover beneath the panel, paused for a moment, then pulled it open with a decisive motion. Behind the truck, 4 long capsules rose vertically, like 4 giant tubes almost extending the length of the vehicle, pointing toward the sky. Inside each tube was one of the things the Kremlin feared most at this stage of the war: the long-range land attack version of the long Neptune cruise missile. The engineer standing next to the TEL looked at the last line on his laptop: wind, temperature, route, intermediate navigation points, sea skimming profile over the Black Sea. In one corner of the screen, the target package for 4 missiles flashed. The first 2 missiles were for the S-400 clusters stationed at the Kuban regiment. The last 2 missiles were for the pump stations and tank farm at the Sheskharis terminal. The silence was heavy. This silence wasn't just due to the risk. Everyone knew what they were doing. If this launch succeeded, Long Neptune would bury not just a battery, but the S-400 myth and Novorossiysk's untouchable legend. The commander gave a short, clear, ready command. The countdown began. 10, 5, 3. First, a deep rumble split the night. Then the lid of the first capsule at the back of the truck blew open, and a shadow shot out. As soon as the Long Neptune emerged from the tube, the booster ignited, rising vertically amid sparks. Then, a few seconds later, it turned its nose toward the Black Sea and began to descend rapidly. Then the second missile, then the third, then the fourth. The Long Neptunes were gliding at subsonic speed, approximately 900 kilometers per hour, just a few meters above the sea surface. To any distant observer, this was just a line disappearing into the darkness. But hundreds of kilometers away, the fate of a port and an air defense battalion hung in the balance. At that moment, suddenly, in the command shelter of the Kuban anti-aircraft regiment on the hills east of Novorossiysk, the radar screen in front of the operator on duty was suddenly flooded with red. Until just moments before, the screen had shown only civilian traffic and a few routine tracks gliding slowly over the Black Sea. Then, without warning, dozens, then hundreds of small target dots suddenly appeared. The sector sounded the alarm. The targets were at different altitudes, coming from different directions, flowing directly over Novorossiysk.
Oh, drone. Drone is here. Oops.
The Long Neptunes were flying just a few meters above sea level at that moment, literally skimming the sea surface. This flight profile meant slipping below the radar horizon. The S-400's theoretical range of 400 kilometers was, at that moment, only theoretical due to the curvature of the Earth. No matter how powerful you make the radar, you cannot correct for the curvature of the Earth. Ukraine turned this physics to its advantage. After leaving the missile ramp, the Long Neptune first climbed to a safe altitude and locked its course using INS/GNSS. Then, as it approached the Black Sea, it rapidly descended. It was now both reducing its radar cross-section and advancing in a corridor invisible to the S-400s. Meanwhile, FP-1 and FP-2 kamikaze UAVs deliberately dove into the very heart of the S-400 radar lobes, forcing operators to lock onto weak, hard-to-select echoes. At first glance, the image on the Russian officers' screens was a massive swarm. Target or jammer? Cruise missile or simple quadcopter? The screen was a mess. The Russian operators chose the reflex their training dictated: fire at the most visible, densest cluster. This was the deadliest tactical mistake of the night, because they were decoys sent to overwhelm the radar screen. Soon, long Neptune cruise missiles, each carrying hundreds of kilograms of explosives, would turn this screen and this city into a veritable hell from far behind the map. They were flowing in a wide arc at different altitudes, directly towards the Krasnodar region and Novorossiysk. The drones were infiltrating at low altitude, occasionally changing altitude, jumping their radar tracks, and challenging Russian air defense algorithms. Some were heading towards coastal radar positions, some towards command centers in the interior, and some towards air defense batteries around the port. The Nebo M and 96N6 radars instantly found themselves in the midst of a massive chaos. The screens filled with hundreds of small targets. Threat classification software elevated even these inexpensive drones to high-priority target status. The first Pantsir batteries began riddling the sky. Then, the S-300 and S-400 batteries fired their expensive interceptor missiles. The white streaks piercing the night, the bright explosions opening up in the sky, were reflected in the sailors' cameras at the port like an air defense show. That slightly mocking, "Very nice," comment you hear in the background of those videos was actually a live description of the Russian air defense system consuming itself. Russian operators thought, "We're taking them all down," and excitedly tracked the kill count numbers on the console. But the real critical mistake was made right here. All attention was locked on the sky, on high altitude. The clutter and target swarm on the screen obscured the real threat, because right behind the FP swarms, over the Black Sea, 4 long Neptunes were gliding along the wave crests, slipping in from the very bottom edge of the radar envelope, the dead band. The sea skimming profile instantly weakened the powerful radars of the S-400s. These systems were designed to hunt high and medium altitude targets from hundreds of kilometers away. A cruise missile flying just a few meters above the sea surface, remaining just within the horizon line, would only appear on the screen in the final moments as a faint trace. That is, if the operator's eyes weren't elsewhere at that moment. The first 2 long Neptunes rose slightly after crossing the coastline and took on the silhouette of the hills. The IIR heads woke up. Hotspots appeared one by one on the thermal scene. On a hill, a giant 96N6 radar antenna was spinning as an orange spot. Right next to it, the 92N6 engagement radar was visible with its rectangular panel. On a slope, 4 S-400 launchers parked side by side left a warm silhouette in the night's cold with their cylindrical tubes. The software inside Neptune matched this image with a template in its memory. Radar, gunner, launcher, all merged into a single deadly package. The first missile, with a slight nose correction, settled on top of one of the S-400 positions. It came low, rose at the last second, and plunged right into the center of the radar launcher cluster. For a moment, everything froze. Then, a massive explosion rising over the hills split the sky above Novorossiysk. The warhead of the long Neptune detonated next to the launchers parked beside the radar. In the first moment of the explosion, the spinning head of the 96N6 was thrown into the air, its scattered fragments mowing down the surrounding equipment. Milliseconds later, some of the S-400 missiles inside the launchers also reacted and began to explode one after another. It was a chain reaction. First an explosion, then columns of fire gushing from 4 separate points. Cameras on the port side recorded a flash of light, followed by a giant fireball swelling with the second, third, and fourth explosions. The second long Neptune headed for the other cluster seconds later. This time the target was the other launchers clustered near the 92N6 engagement radar. According to telemetry, the missile hit its target with only a few meters of deviation. The same scene repeated itself. First the Neptune strike, then the generators exploding, and finally, a series of S-400 warheads flying into the sky like an uncontrolled fireworks display. Satellite images leaked in the early morning clarified the picture. At least 4 S-400 launchers were destroyed. 2 96N6 early warning radars and 2 92N6 target acquisition radars were completely wiped out. The remaining 8 launchers were still on the field, but they were now nothing more than blind and deaf shells, unaware of what or how to strike. The first two long Neptunes had completed their missions, breaking through the Kuban regiment's shield. And at that very moment, the other two long Neptunes had already entered from the Black Sea, following their deadly course towards Sheskharis. There was no longer any serious threat in the sky for them. The S-400s were burning. The Pantsirs and short-range systems were still struggling with the FP-1 and FP-2 swarms, locking onto the wrong targets, losing their firing discipline. The third long Neptune was still skimming the sea surface when it reached Novorossiysk. This time, the IIR head scanned the hotspots on the coast, not the hills. The tank area of the Sheskharis oil terminal glowed as huge round hotspots in night vision. The rectangular buildings housing the pumping stations right next to it gave off a denser, sharper heat signature. The missile locked onto the pumping station. In the final second, it rose slightly, then dove at an almost vertical angle. At the moment of impact, a white light flashed and grew at the heart of the terminal. The long Neptune's warhead detonated directly above the main manifold. The shockwaves shattered the pump system, the command room, and the power distribution center in a single blow. Then the fire, walking through the pipelines, spread through the veins of the port. The fourth long Neptune was a few seconds behind. Its mission was to render the tank farm inoperable. The missile selected one of the full tanks. Its IIR warhead locked onto its heat signature and shape. The dive, the explosion, then the giant fireball rising into the sky. This was precisely the scene that Turkish sailors at the port described as hellish. The astonished but admiring, "Very beautiful," heard in the background of the footage was, in fact, a summary of the moment when 4 Ukrainian missiles, coming from 1,000 kilometers away, brought one of Russia's most important ports to its knees. 2 long Neptunes incinerated the S-400 battalion on the hills in a chain reaction, while 2 long Neptunes plunged like daggers into the pump station and tank area of the Sheskharis. The port, which had relied on the S-400s, was suddenly defenseless, completely exposed to Ukrainian UAV swarms and additional attack platforms. A new wave of drones entered from different vectors. Some were verifying the perimeter of the pump area previously hit by long Neptune. Some were searching for intact facilities, while others were heading for the container yard and the port's internal infrastructure. In the darkness of the night, flashes of explosions multiplied one by one over the bay. A UAV landed on the roof of the Energy Control Center. With the explosion, most of the terminal went into emergency shutdown mode. But since the core of the system that would send the emergency shutdown command had also been hit, not even half of this procedure worked. In the tank yard, new explosions added to the burning of the large tank, which stood like a wounded giant after Neptune's first strike. The fire was not only growing, it was deepening. At the same time, explosions were also recorded in the container yard. At least 1 civilian ship was damaged by falling drone debris and the shockwave, and 3 crew members were reported injured. When these images hit social media, the world realized that Novorossiysk had been hit not only militarily, but also in its civilian aspect. This was no longer the rear front. This was the very heart of Russia's domestic front. The Russian Ministry of Defense made a reflexive statement. 66 Ukrainian UAVs were shot down in the Krasnodar region. Perhaps dozens of drones had indeed been shot down. But this did not change the fact that the main swarm had reached its target. The Russian Defense Ministry's narrative of victory had suddenly become a fiasco. Governor Veniamin Kondratiev could no longer brush off this fire with statements like, "We have it under control." The panic was so great that he was forced to officially declare a state of emergency in the city. Independent Russian sources, such as The Insider, confirmed that a state of emergency had been declared in Novorossiysk and that the port area had been completely closed off. Thank you for choosing us.